the format dramatically. And we're hanging out our feature match area where the other big news is this black-white flicker deck, popularized by Theo Jung here on your right, has taken over sort of as the control deck du jour of the format. Players are playing things like Breach in order to combo kill. That means control decks like this that can sometimes line up pretty well and have powerful sideboard cards to become real forces in the metagame. And actually, Niall, this deck was the top performing deck across all RCs last weekend, beating Breach. Now, it was by 0.3% when it comes to data, but it was a win.
Hey, 0.3% is 0.3%. As you said, that is a win. I am very excited to watch Theo play this deck. I think the deck is so sweet. It's been so cool to see it in all of these different events. And I mean, we know Theo is such a strong, powerful Magic player. I can't wait to see how he does here today.
Yeah, Theo, I mean, our champ from last year, a Pro Tour mainstay, someone you'll see on those feature match areas a lot. And, like I said, someone who popularized this deck. A fun little side story is when Theo won the first challenge with this deck shortly after the BNR, it said, hey, I don't think my deck's very good, but I made a bet with a friend and I'm going to play it. It's sort of like this is my personal baby. And players were kind of like, no, I think your deck's really good. And we've been seeing that since then. So I just love that Theo started with, please don't play this. And then people have adopted it en masse and it's done great.
Yeah, and we're going to see a really great start here for Theo. I was reading that turn 1 Aether Vial, which very powerful card. Now, we haven't talked much about across the table from Theo here. We have John Wegner. He is on the Frogtide deck, which feels like Murktide has really evolved and taken a lot of different forms over the years in this format. And right now, that form seems to be a Dimir deck utilizing Psychic Frog from MH3, and then the Abhorrent Oculus. Very, very cool card. Interesting stuff to, sort of cheat out of the graveyard with these unearth effects. What do you think about this matchup, Mason?
So this is a tough one for John. I mean, if you're John and you see Theo as your opponent, you're like, oh no. Then you see this turn 1 Aether Vial and you're like, oh no. As you see John bend a counterspell, has another counterspell in hand. Aether Vial, as long as there isn't a crazy amount of pressure, Theo's going to get to play all of his cards uncounterably if he wants to, And he has a couple instants and sorceries in his deck, but really 90% of his spells are creatures. So he's going to be able to get them underneath that. And that would be a problem in its own right. But in addition, the creatures line up very well against a lot of the threats. We've seen Felia Exuberant Herder really kind of take over in this modern format, along with cards like Psychic Frog from MH3, these powerful 2-drops. But being able to flicker a Murktide so it loses all its counters, or a Frog that you went in on, has huge implications.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and we do see the Ephemerate already in Theo's hand as we are going back over to his turn. You get an uptick on our Aether Vial up to 1 counter on it now, as we're just going to go ahead and fetch for a basic Plains. It looks like here, as we've got a Frog on the board for John, which for whatever it's worth is, already able to jump over Theo's blockers, assuming he's not able to put up any flyers here. But we are just going to go ahead and see the Overlord of the Baelmerk impending out, which is going to give Theo this trigger. And it looks like we are going to get a Witch Enchanter as the card we are picking up from that. Pretty nice to be able to, use that effect to get a creature or a land, depending on what you need there.
Yeah, I mean, this has been the big thing that's kind of moved the needle. So the One Ring obviously was the best card advantage engine in Modern, maybe one of the best in Magic's history, if we're being honest. Overlord of the Baelmerk, players were a little skeptical this is a standard card, but we've seen, these Overlords are very strong in standard. And in this deck, the trick, is that cards like Felia, Flicker Whiffs, they flicker this out and it comes back. So, a play pattern that can happen is Theo end of turn plays the dog turn 2, then plays this and immediately flickers it, draws 2 cards, and has a 5/5 on the board. If you played Modern 10 years ago, that might not sound good enough. The creatures today and the free spells, it is good enough. Now, you're not going to beat a Storm deck with that, but there's a lot of decks that just cannot beat that much value.
Yeah, so we're going to see John go ahead and consider away a Harbinger off the top of his deck, attacking in with the Psychic Frog. And it looks like before damage here, we are discarding a Fatal Push. Maybe thinking about discarding more. Nope, just gonna go ahead and get in there with the single counter on the Frog and draw our card.
Yeah, I tell this to a lot of people in coaching about the frog tide deck. The one damage almost is like not enough, right? And I sort of joke with people that the first time you connect with frog, you must discard something if your hand isn't perfect because you need to get the clock going. And that's one of the real issues we've seen with Murktide decks in the past. They need to close the door quickly. That's why Murktide is sort of, always a four of, or at least in high numbers. Now, we do see these new age versions lowering that a little bit. The threat count has increased dramatically, especially when it comes to closing the door efficiently. And I like that from John there. Could have gone a little more in, but knows there's a lot of things that can reset the frog's power toughness. So doesn't want to commit too hard and get blown out.
Yeah, as we are going to go ahead and see on Theo's turn, we're just going to uptick our Aether Vial, take down our impending creature here, just play our land and pass with Aether Vial on 2 and 3 mana up. What a scary sight if you are John here.
Yeah, there's a couple things that Theo can do that would be like fairly strong, like Aven Interrupter. Another Theo just likes standard cards in Aether Vial. That's what's happened, I think, this weekend. But that's something that if John tries to commit to a Murktide, he doesn't really have the mana currently, at least, to protect it with a counter spell, and that would be pretty devastating. But also, this Vial on 2 is just representing all of the creatures uncounterable. So, even if Theo has, double 2 or whatever, a lot of his 2s also have flash. So John has to think about a lot of things here.
Yeah, a lot of options open for Theo. John thinking about what to do. We know there is a counterspell and a consider. It looks like a Murktide and a frog in hand for John here.
Yep. I think what John's thinking about is thinking to Stupor is our top card. I think we're thinking about, are we maybe going to bolt this in order to play Murktide plus counterspell? And it looks like we did discard the second Fatal Push.
Now, Fatal Push seems like it would be a good card against a lot of Theo's creatures. Most of them, are Fatal Pushable, but is the tricky spot here for John just that it is hard to actually target any of Theo's things with spells, knowing that he can, ephemerate them away at any time?
That's definitely part of it. I would also say the dog is like the only great one to Fatal Push. Every other creature in Theo's deck has a strong ETB for the most part. Emperor of Bones, also one you could argue, like that's pretty good. Lots of times Theo's will try and set it up so that card immediately gets value. But this card from H3 Felia here is like the one. I think John was thinking, well, Theo never put it in play when I had a chance. Maybe I'll just discard it, as we do see Sink into Stupor on the dog.
Yeah, and looks like Sink into Stupor happened after the dog attacked. So it looks like we did get that trigger on the creature here. As we're going to play a Recruiter of the Guard. Go ahead and search the library for a creature's toughness 2 or less. It looks like we are going to get Flicker Wisp from that.
Yeah, and Nile, here comes Value Town. Because with that Vial on 3, this Flicker Wisp can flicker both the Recruiter or the Overlord, but also it can flicker away this Psychic Frog as well. And you're seeing Theo hit another Recruiter.
Yeah, that is a lot. Oh, we're just going to go ahead and vial in the Skyclave Apparition onto the frog.
I love this here from Theo. Remember, our events are not open deck lists like the RC or Pro Tours like that. So there is some hidden information. And we've seen some players play a couple Toshani Tidebinders and things of that nature. And these frog lists, very customizable. So Theo's just saying, hey, I know I'm going to get rid of this frog. I have this Skyclave. I'm just going to do it now, not get Tidebindered and, potentially be very upset. So great play there from Theo. Also, it makes it so Fatal Push isn't a live card to hit the Skyclave apparition back. John keeps discarding Fatal Push. Theo might think, well, homie has a bunch of Fatal Pushes. Why would you do that?
Right, as we are going to see a large and in charge Murktide here. It's going to have quite a bit to exile. Yeah, that looks like it's going to be as many counters as we could possibly get on this guy.
A Super Size Me moment.
Super Size Me moment indeed. John with just 2 islands up, but we know there is a counter spell. Looks like Theo choosing to leave the Aether Vial on 3 here. I mean, we do know he's got 2 3-cost creatures that are face up in hand. Got the Ephemerate, I've got Ophelia in hand.
Yeah, it looks like Theo thought of essentially starting off with maybe at play Vile, Flicker Wisp your Murktide and attack, but instead it's going to cast a Recruiter of the Guard. Putting it backwards there if you're curious because doesn't want to accidentally attack with it. Remember, it's Summoning Sickness, gets counterspelled.
That's going to go ahead and get countered as we're going to go ahead and crack this Marsh Flats for a land here. Just going to be a basic Plains. Very important source of mana here. That one Plains up keeps this Ephemerate online. So it looks like we are going to Ephemerate the Recruiter. Theo determined to get this Recruiter effect across. And that's going to be a Solitude.
Yeah, and you're seeing why I kind of compared this to a control deck at the start. When I first started playing this deck, I kind of thought it was taxes. And to be fair, I think, when a lot of people say taxes, they mean creature control. But I think this deck plays a lot more like the Omnath 4-color deck, which was very loved by many players, as it just grinds the opponents out and then worries about winning later.
Yeah, as we are going to go ahead and pitch cast that Solitude to get rid of the Murktide, and then attack in with our creatures, which is going to trigger our Overlord. And we're going to get another Recruiter of the Guard back. Got the Ephemerate Rebound coming up next turn. Theo just feels so in control of this game right now.
Yeah, I mean, in Magic games go wild. It's hard to ever call it early. I'm thinking about making a DoorDash order, though. It sounds like to me I've got a little bit of time at the rate this game's going because John has some threats and had a pretty good start. Like against this deck, you need to have stuff like Psychic Frog early to force their hand to get those extra resources and then try to grind through them. But just not being able to do it here this game, as Theo's holding up this Flicker Wisp as a way to protect his creatures if there was a kill spell, right? But also, just like we mentioned, has a Recruiter to go grab another Solitude or a Felia or anything we want from the deck. I think the only non-tutorable card in Theo's deck this weekend is an Overlord of the Baelmerk when it comes to his main deck. So tough place to be.
Looks like at the end of John's turn here, we're going to use our Aether Vial to get this Recruiter of the Guard into play. Theo flipping through his deck, looking at a Flicker Wisp. Looks like that is going to be the pick for Theo here. And something that I think is really interesting about watching really good pilots of this deck over the last couple of weeks is they seem, totally fine getting their opponent's life totals pretty high. With all of these Solitudes and stuff, we end up seeing a lot of the times pretty high life totals against them, but they just feel like they are so in control of the game. It looks like we're having a judge call here about this Ephemerate.
Yeah, so what ended up happening last turn, we notified the judges, is Theo remember Theo cast a Recruiter, it got countered, and then we ephemerated the Recruiter. That meant the Recruiter couldn't attack. So last turn, Theo actually got one more point of damage in. I think it's probably a moment where, one, Theo, an incredibly clean player. I think this is just, a little bit of early morning and just a little misstep. We thought we were going to get this off and get our attack in. Obviously, that didn't happen. We don't know exactly. I'm not a judge, but I imagine what's going to happen here is Theo's going to get a warning, and we're probably just going to give John one life. John was tapped out with no creatures in play. Didn't really change the game, but I'll let the judge be the ruling of that. That's not my job, not my rodeo. Mine's to talk and look good, and I'm doing both.
Now let's talk about what John can feasibly do from here, because the Dimir Frogtide deck does have a lot of explosive turns and power, right? I mean, getting an Oculus into play is always a big deal. What is there anything that John can feasibly do to start to regain some ground in this game here?
So, I mean, Oculus is good. It will create a lot of chump blockers. And theoretically, you could even see a situation where, you get an Oculus down. Maybe we then find a way to get this Overlord off the board and we race in the air and barely stabilize. The problem is this Overlord's getting, a value trigger every time, right? And there aren't many things that actually kill it in John's deck. There are lots of things that could unsummon it, like we saw, Sinking the Stupor. But once it's kind of on the board, it's either trading in combat or, it needs to get bounced, which means it gets more triggers. So John needs to figure out a way to get something down the board, pressure Theo enough, and go the distance. Theo's deck's actually not very good at actually closing the door without the Overlord or a Felia or an Emperor Bones. Those are sort of the biggest creatures to various amounts here. It looks like the players are still talking to the judge. The judge is stepping away for a second to double check something. We'll give you all the ruling as soon as we know it. But yeah, so there is some things that John can do, but it's really tough that Theo has this overlord in play. John decided to fight over the Felia a couple turns back instead of bouncing the overlord, and I think that might have been a little bit of a misstep. It might seem like it's not that big a deal. And I think if you haven't played against Overlord, it's a little innocuous how good it actually is. For example, lots of people think it's only the milled cards you can choose from. It's your whole graveyard. And that's a huge difference. We saw that Theo could have flicker whisked the Murktide. It would have been, a fairly clean answer. We move on with our day. Yada, yada, yada. We have a 3-1 on the board. But what ended up happening instead is Theo got a Solitude. It went down a card, quote unquote, to answer the Murktide because Theo wanted the ability to hey, if I don't hit a Recruiter off this Overlord to get a Solitude, I just want to pick up Solitude. And that play pattern is backbreaking for these Frogtide decks, which do not have a good matchup against these sort of controlling decks if they can get to the point where they're sticking Solitudes. Typically, that's hard for those decks to actually do against the Frogtide deck. I should say at least not easy. But they're more rigid than Theo's deck is. We're seeing how much value, how hard it is to interact here, and just how much everything kind of needs to be answered. So, this is why we're seeing a little bit of, some doubts in the community on the Frogtide deck. Some of the matchups in the metagame are just shaping up to not be good for them. They have a tough energy matchup. So many cheap creatures. They get underneath you, strong 1-mana removal spells, a tough place to be. Eldrazi, a matchup that, if they come prepared for you, they can fight back a little bit. You have a lot of consigned to memories in your sideboard, but, I got to remind players that countering one spell is not enough all the time. Now, sometimes it is against these Eldrazi decks. They go all in and they have to, ramp something out and you get an early frog, but it's not free. And then this deck's a tough matchup, along with some other ones in the format being tricky. So, the frog deck, in my mind, really needs to innovate in a big way to really redefine itself on the metagame.
Yeah, and something I'm seeing in John's list here that I'm kind of interested in for this game is these 2 copies of Nihil Spellbomb. Because something I think that we've seen over and over the last couple of weeks with this black-white flicker deck is a lot of times the deck size gets really low, and sometimes they even mill themselves out. With how powerful this Overlord is, it is still mill 4 every turn, which is quite a lot. So you think there's any world where with these spell bombs, John can maybe start to set up enough chump blockers to just keep his life total stable, take care of the graveyard when it matters to keep Theo from generating too much value? And is there possibly a mill angle here?
There might be. I think no matter what happens, it's going to be a situation where multiple Oculuses or multiple Murktides need to hit the battlefield sooner than later. And I could see a world where if you have a couple Oculuses, you're able to stall things up enough. Maybe the game gets a little freaky with it, and then we keep going. It seems to me like currently the judge ruling is there is no fix. And so we would continue the game state from here. But Theo is, I believe, actually appealing that John should get a life. As you can see here, Theo's talking to the judge. So we got the official ruling. The floor judge ruling was, this is going to be a GRV. You failed to maintain game state, etc. Please play tight and, keep an eye out on for you're playing good magic. We're not going to change life totals, though. Theo's saying, hey, I think that's dumb. I think essentially, I think he's saying, I disagree. I think my opponent should get a life back. Now, if I was Theo in this situation, I just might not attack with the Recruiter in a chance where I later could. Obviously, that gives its own benefits, right? It's on defense.
Yeah, sure.
It's not a clean fix. I might even tell my opponent, I have no intention to block with this card. But Theo here, I do believe, is trying to say, like, hey, I really messed this up. This doesn't seem fair to my opponent. This is on me. I mean, there's no other way to really interpret this, right? Theo's the one who appealed, and we can clearly see frustration on his face right now. As you see him kind of smiling and shaking his head like, I don't know, that seems silly to me. But, the rulings are the rulings, and I think that's just where we're going to continue play here in a second is at 15 life for John here. And you know what? good on Theo for trying to do what he thinks is right after, a misstep here. And we're going to continue to play with this ephemerate, targeting one of the recruiter or the guards. Yeah, and you see Theo putting it back there, like not attacking with this one. And we even saw it last turn too, by the way. I just want to highlight Theo tried to play the one recruiter that was something sick upside down as to make sure we don't accidentally attack. Very clear Theo's trying to maintain a clean board state here, as Solitude is the search. And we were talking during the break there, Niall, this is the problem.
Yeah, I mean, this Recruiter of the Guard is just so powerful in Theo's deck. It gets literally every single creature in his deck except for the Overlord. That is so powerful. A 3-mana 1/1, grab any creature you want out of your deck.
Yep. We're going to play a Boggart
We're going to hard cast this Solitude. We've got the mana. We can afford it. Solitude going into the I can't attack with this zone.
I was curious if John had something in hand that they maybe wanted to discard, like a second Oculus, just to gain a life and also hope to rip an Unearth, but it doesn't look like that was the case.
Yeah. It's like John at 16 life. Oh, gained 1 from the frog. Yeah. We're going to go ahead and attack and get another Solitude out of the yard with our Overlord.
And there's the Nihil Spell Bomb.
Yeah, as we are back over, John, gonna go ahead and play the Nihil Spell Bomb at 8 life, though. Life total so low for John. And there is an Oculus.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. John needs to do stuff like this just to not be dead on board, but also knows Theo has a Solitude. Now, Theo might be thinking, is there a subtlety? Do I even want to play around it if it was there, But the Solitude is just proving to be a big issue, and it shows why these Murktide decks have always had issues with the Solitude decks.
Yeah, and here comes the Flicker Wisp. It's like we are flickering the Oculus during the instep.
Yep, and this is a sick trick here. Since it says the next instep, that will be gone during all of Theo's turn, and then Theo will be able to attack through 4 lethal here with this massive board state. I think Theo's thinking about, can I attack with not the Overlord in order to not mill? Okay, Theo's just going to attack with everything. I was going to say, you could not attack the Overlord to play around your opponent getting a little information here, but yeah.
And that is going to be lethal. That is going to be game 1 going to Theo Jung here. Congratulations, Theo. I mean, expertly piloting this pretty tricky deck and taking the first game of our series, of our showdown here. As we're going to take a look at our deck list, here is the Frogtide list from John Wegner. Taking a look at this real quick, Mason, anything stand out to you? Is this looking pretty stock? How are you feeling?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple things we can do in the sideboard. When it comes to the main deck, like fairly stockish, Bloodchief's Thirst, is a card we've seen players pick up as a way to kind of have another kill spell, and it can kill a flip to Johnny. So that's been a pretty interesting innovation, there, if you're looking at the deck list screen here. But from the sideboard, we don't have a ton of things we can do. Now, we can bring in Consign to memory, and we can consign the return trigger on things like Felia and Flicker Wisp as a way to maybe stop some of these shenanigans that are going to occur. Try to create like blue kill spell, essentially. Not the best plan in the world. That does require your opponent to kind of have some of their best cards already going, but it is something you can do. And I probably would have to end up doing in a lot of spots. And then Stern Scolding, that's the big one. Counter target creature with power or toughness 2 or less. That is, toughness 2 or less is so important. No, it is power toughness. I'm not going to doubt myself ever again. I'm the GOAT. It's both those things. But countering this card here is so big because of the Solitude. I mean, obviously the whole deck is like basically creatures with toughness 2 or less to make Recruiter work. But the big one is Solitude. We saw how in that game there was a Flicker Wisp with the Aether Vial that removed it. But there'd be lots of other games where you don't get your Aether Vial set up, or maybe it gets interacted with a little bit. And then having this as a way to like cleanly kill, the Solitude that might get cast as a way to protect your threat is going to be needed. Because like we said, John has very few threats, and Theo has lots of answers.
Yeah, and is there any consideration to the surgical extractions in the board here? Do you think there's ever a world where John wants to bring that in against Theo?
I think you could. I think, like the solitude part of the deck is such a like issue. Normally, I really hedge away from surgicaling against fair-ish decks, but there's a little bit of unfairness going on. And if you think you can beat everything but the solitudes, I can understand that sort of approach. Also, you maybe just want to cut all your counter spells, all your force negations. And so maybe the first, surgical is better than like the first, Nihil Spellbomb or Counterspell in that world. So a lot going on there. Toxic Deluge, another card you could consider bringing in this world. A lot of low toughness, so maybe you can, pay 1 or 2 life, clean up some things on the board.
Sure. Well, let's jump over to Theo's list here. I mean, hard to really even say what is stock with the black-white flicker deck at this point. The deck feels very new and being constantly iterated upon. But what are your initial impressions? I mean, I'm seeing a lot of one-of creatures here with the Aven Interrupter, the Trawler, the Apparition, the Scholar, the Orchid Phantom. What are your thoughts here?
Well, one, I gotta say, Theo added the Aven Mindsense to the sideboard, which is something I wanted to do. So I'm glad to see that. That's one of my favorite cards from Old Modern. Glad to see it coming back here. But this matchup is really good for Theo. I'm not exactly. I think there has been some debate, and from players I've seen, kind of like how much they want to sideboard here. Like I've seen players say, like, "Hey, you want to trim on some of your cards that don't really matter." Like these sort of awkward-ish threats in your deck, like something like Tidehearted Skull that it kind of more reliability. Maybe you want to trim like a Fatal Push and you want to bring in some cards like Thoughtseize in order to like try and remove the big threat or like their sideboard card and clear the way for that. I've seen people say you want to bring in your White Orchid Phantoms in order to, make it so your opponent has more threats to deal with. Sometimes you mana screw your opponent as well or fix yourself. So there's a couple ways to go about it. I sort of generally like to approach this matchup with a very light touch. I'm not going to bring in a whole bunch of things. I kind of like Avid Interrupter on the play, but I'm not even in love with it. It's kind of awkward. So I'm interested to see how Theo does this because, like we said, Theo's the one who popularized this deck and, has only played 2 challenges with the deck, but has won both challenges. So, Theo is someone who's very accomplished, very strong, and seems to be really in tune with this deck.
Yeah, as we are getting into the match now, John on the play, having just a fetch land for turn 1. Theo drawing the Aether Vial as his draw for turn 1. Fetch, shock, Aether Vial. What a start for Theo. Let's see if John has anything to say about it.
Yeah, one
Looks
thing
like
I'll
that
note.
might be resolving.
Yeah, I think this is just it's down, but I'm going to surveil. Theoretically, we might have a force, and we might be like making sure we want to know all the information, before we force. But I doubt if that's in our deck. One thing we didn't talk about before that we could see from John is there was engineered explosives in the sideboard. Now, Theo's deck is a lot of 3s, and we have no way to get to 3. High level analysis here, but you can get to 1 pretty easily. And blowing up Aether Vial, if you want to keep the counter spells in your deck, could be a good way to facilitate that. It's just a matter of sort of how do you want to play the games.
And looks like John leaving a card on top. It looks like it was an Oculus, seeing a Nihil Spellbomb. Looks like we do have a Force of Negation, and I think that is the engineered explosives in hand here. As we're going to play out the Nihil Spellbomb. And looks like
Thought Scour.
Yeah, I think I might have missaw. Maybe drew
So
the Thought Scour, not an Oculus.
Yes, yeah. So that I thought that was an Oculus at first as well. I thought it was the full art one, but there is an Oculus in hand of the normal variety. But that was the card that was on top. That art looks very similar to that big old eye.
As we're gonna go back over to Theo, who we have 1 counter on our Aether Vial. Just gonna surveil, leave card on top, and pass back over to John here.
All right, so John decided to leave in both Force of Negation and Counterspell. Did bring in the Engineered Explosives to make these cards a little bit more doable. There's a bit of a wild line here from John that could go really sideways, but I'd be very tempted to do. Main phase, pop that Spell Bomb, get rid of Theo's 1 fetch land, a little oomph, fetch, and then slam the Oculus. And just be like, Theo, don't have a Solitude, friend. You're up. And I know that sounds a little aggressive, but John needs to get threats going sooner or later. We saw at game 1, Theo very, very methodically activated Vial, didn't worry about too much, took his time, did not want to fall too far behind to counter spells. And while Theo might, try to not play around those cards as much, when your opponent's not playing anything, Theo doesn't feel pressured to, and Theo might even be like, well, maybe this person left in a couple counter spells just in case. As it looks like we are going to play Engineered Explosives on 1 here. Looks like John might be a little ahead of himself on wanting to pop that card as we saw the tapping of the mana.
Yeah, it looks like we've got the Engineered Explosives down. It's like we don't have a 4th land at the moment. We're going to go ahead and fetch a land here. Now, slightly unfortunate that if we're about to pop this explosive, we are also going to lose our spell bomb.
Yeah, it kind of sucks, but that is life, and this, I think a good way to think about this, Niall, is, well, first off, Niall, I know you're trying to protect the spell bomb. We all know, don't get clever about it. Not tricking anyone here. But the Aether Vial is acting a lot like a Soul Ring right now that gives your creatures uncounterable, and it's about to turn into a Black Lotus that gives your creatures uncounterable. And when I tell you, you basically, against a counterspell deck, get to have, uncounterable 3 mana over and over again, that is so hard for anyone to beat. Now, it looks like what John's doing here is we're main phase fetching now so we don't get got by any shenanigans. You could have seen like a Vial activation to get rid of the Engineered Explosives, and then it has 0 counters on it when it comes back. But, okay, it looks like we're going to keep the shields up. Yeah, John wants to keep the counterspell up as to not let anything try to hit and maybe eventually work towards this EE activation.
Sure. As we did see Theo draw another Aether Vial last turn. I mean, the turn 4 Aether Vial is certainly less impressive than the turn 1 Aether Vial, but being able to simply reestablish it after it gets blown up, pretty nice. Although, having to keep it in hand, having to respect this Engineered Explosive, kind of rewarding John for this patience with the EE here.
Yeah, as we're seeing, I'm a little curious. So I think what John might be doing here is a little known tricky dick, which is Nihil Spellbomb says when it's put into the graveyard, you can pay the black in order to have it happen. And basically, I think what he might be doing is saying, I'm going to pop my EE and then pay the black so that I get the card from the Spellbomb hitting. I'm not exactly sure. It just seems to me that that was sort of the intention here. It does look like the Engineered Explosives is getting popped. Now, in response to activation, the Vial can still be activated. So, Theo does get value, but at least this Vial is gone, and these counterspells in John Wegner's hand is going to really get more activation. Looks like there's some conversation happening. Oh, I see what happened. So last turn, John fetched an island, but that was a Bloodstained Mire. You see Theo smile a little. Scoreboard even here. But yeah, so John accidentally grabbed the wrong kind of land. Obviously, black-red fetches can't get basic island. That's why they put me here, Niall. I have the insight like that.
Yeah, that's why they call you the expert, knowing which basics we can get with which fetch lands. That is high-level stuff. So we're going to go ahead and get a judge here, talk about what happened, see what we can do.
It's really funny because in my mind, I was thinking that John should have probably actually got Swamp because John does have Harbinger of the Seas in the deck. And I don't know if they're in, but, Harbinger turns all the lands into islands, so there's no real worry about that. So you really wanted the Swamp, but it didn't occur to me when I was thinking about it that was not Delta. I think what's going to probably end up happening here is we've probably gone too far, and we're just going to let it lie. I don't know. Once again, we'll give you the ruling when we get it from the judge. But you know what I do know, Niall, is that there are more energy events coming up later this year. Do you want to quickly throw those on screen for us here so we can talk about them? Because we have a lot of fun, magic, and slight GRVs to cover here the rest of this year. As we see Mox champion Will Kruger, roommate of Theo there in the background, coming over to watch his future match area and probably give his friend a hard time after this about everything that's going on here. But we're going to be going all across, the states here, playing in these tournaments, giving you a chance to come. So we'd love to have you come on out and play.
Yeah, absolutely. As we've got, Obviously, Chicagoland this weekend. And then, soon in March, I believe we're going to be in Madison, and then coming back to Chicagoland, and then Indianapolis. I think I got it all from memory. Who needs a slide? We've got modern showdowns. Here it is. We've got standard showdowns. And then the one that's so exciting to me, June 28th and 29th at Indianapolis, the 10K team sealed showdown. I'm going to tell you now, I'm sick that weekend. Not going to be able to be in the booth. Gonna be mysteriously in Indianapolis playing team sealed. What a fun event.
Yep, and I believe our ruling is fixed, so let's head back to the feature match area to watch some more Magic. But yeah, it looks like we're just continuing here, but we'll, get it exactly for you here in a second. I think this is just a second of double checking, like, should we have you search or whatever. But yeah, I mean, those are exciting. Team sealed is a very hard but very fun format. Obviously, all the team events, you get to hang out with your friends all weekend. What a blast. You get to have a forever story about who weighed who down, which is just good, healthy relationships we love to encourage here. But jokes aside, it's really fun, to build sealed pools. They're very high skill and very hard. Like the fun thing to me about sealed Nile is, right, there's a theoretical best deck, or the best deck for each time you play your round, right? Like maybe you're supposed to change your deck up given what your opponent sees. And doing that times 3 is such an interesting, thought experience. A lot of players are a little hesitant. They're like, oh, what if I just open 12, dual lands or whatever, and I have no rares? Well, that doesn't really happen, let alone in these team environments. So I'm excited to see, that coverage and how players will deal with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Going to be very fun. I know for me personally, I can never remember the team trios events where I weighed a team down, but I will never forget the ones where I was weighed down by my team. So truly, really, really healthy stuff, really healthy thought patterns and relationships here. I love a team event.
Yeah.
Looks like we're not backing anything up. We've got a GRV to John. GRVs for everyone. You get a GRV, you get a GRV. Look under your chair, you get a GRV. Everyone in this game here. As we're going to go ahead and start resolving this EE. Aether Vial is going to go away. Nihil Spell Bomb going to go away. Now John has the option, as you mentioned earlier, to go ahead and pay the 1, draw this card that will take him off of Counterspell. Okay.
So it looks like maybe what John's saying is, all right, so you activated Vial in response, and in response to that, I'm activating Spell Bomb to get rid of your fetch land, and then get the card. It's the same. Now I think
John is just on the 1 land up with 2 counter spells in hand here.
Yeah, I think this might have been a bit of and this I am so sorry with all the confusion. I thought this was the end of Theo's turn. That was into John's turn.
Yeah.
Activating the spell bomb to get a card. Listen, don't get me wrong. I brought it up. I love drawing a card here. I think we had to leave our mana up there for counterspell. I was a little confused on the game state there. That's on me. As you're seeing here now, John got a card. Theo gets the attack in with the Felia and gets any card and a counter.
Yeah, and we're gonna replay a spell bomb. Recruiter gonna come back. Felia's gonna get a counter, and Theo just off to the races. And John, looking at these counter spells. Now, is that not a spell snare as well in John's hand?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure there is a spell snare. Excuse me. At least 1 counter spell. I can't tell if it's a spell snare or a cantrip. John's keeping his cards pretty close to the chest there. Doesn't want me to know. So if it was a spell snare, though, that might have been a bit of a small error.
As we're going to go ahead and fetch here. This is a delta. Anything we get is legal.
John, actually on the Esper build, grabs the planes. We got to get a judge.
We're just going to get a surveil land here.
Yeah, I think the players jokingly, Theo saying, hey, what fetch was that? But like you said there, the blue-black duels in your blue-black deck, your fetches are going to be able to get them. You don't need to worry about that too much.
Yeah, so taking a look at the top here.
And these Surveyor lands, were a big get for a lot of decks in Modern, especially nice for decks like this where, turn one, I've seen players like into their turn fetch Surveil and then unearth Oculuses, like just putting these really like costed to be late game threats into play immediately. So speaking of which, here's an Oculus.
Yeah, here is an Oculus. Once again, we're in this kind of awkward mana spot, though, of just having one land up with these counter spells in hand.
Yeah, and I mean, this is sort of why during the, we were talking about the deck, and I was like, maybe there just needs to be like a restructuring. This is sort of what I meant. Like, it's really awkward sometimes to play your cards, and John even has like a large amount of mana, which is normally the choke point. Normally it's like, okay, I got to get to this land while having all these things and the time, etc. John's hit a lot of it, but still doesn't have it. And that is like a really, I think telling thing that maybe these decks need to lean themselves down and clean up a little bit, get more 1 and 0 mana cards in the deck. Always strong. Once again, that's why they pay me the big bucks. Add the cheaper, stronger cards to your deck, because we are going to see a Force Negation on this Fatal Push.
Isn't this John's turn?
But it is John's turn, yeah. So I think John a little confused about where we were there. Hey, John, it's 1-1 on that, friend. I was confused a second ago.
All right. Looks like we're going back over to Theo. We have a counter on the Aether Vial now. Does not do much for us till we get it up to 2.
I'll tell you what does something for us, though, is this Emperor of Bones, Niall.
Oh, and we are going to immediately take this Oculus under the Emperor of Bones. That is scary.
Yeah, Theo will have the ability to adapt this Emperor of Bones and put an Oculus into play. You can do that for offense, again, attack in, or use it on defense. It looks like Theo's just holding up mana, is going to flicker the Recruiter and search. But yeah, you're going to see how, one, we just turned off Unearth, right? So like if that was the backup plan here for John, that's not going to work. And also on the next turn, Theo could, be attacking for an additional 7 damage, 2 from the counters, 5 from the Oculus.
Yeah, I mean, again, very commanding position for Theo here. And John with just a handful of these counter spells that just aren't really doing anything. I think a Harbinger, the pickup for the turn here.
And you're seeing Theo's board. It's, all plane. Oh, excuse me, not that is not a planes. Those are all duels about to turn all into islands. So Theo is taking a second to be like, am I supposed to do something here? I could ephemerate, but looks like he's fine with this sort of using Aether Vial to play the game and not really worrying too much about it.
Yeah, absolutely. As we are, getting into it here. And I mean, we also do still have this Felia on board, right? Like if we ever really need to get something out with our lands here.
That's a great point. Yeah, just flicker the Drowner and be like, hey, guess what? Emperor does get to exile anything there, which is always a nice little bonus text.
Yeah, I get to keep chunking through John's graveyard here. Looks like we are flickering the Recruiter.
I think Theo knows, by the way, that John has a bunch of counter spells in hand. He can't fetch.
Sure. Well, he knows for sure that there is a Force of Negation and a Sink and a Super.
That's true. You know what? That's a great point. They are going to Sink into Super the dog. But yeah, I think Theo, I think in general, that Theo's figured out that like there's a ton of reactive cards. And it looks like John is saying, hey, I'm fine with the flicker. And just about the dog now. So we are going to get this Recruiter activated again, which might seem a little silly to some, but you have to remember Theo has to move to discard now. 8 cards in hand. So who's really winning?
That's right.
I'll give you a hint. It's Theo.
Now, we have lost the ability to adapt our Emperor Bones. For as long as this Harbinger stays on the field, which with multiple Solitudes in hand feels like won't be that long, but we'll see.
Bam. Solitude. The real power
Solitude.
play here from Theo is not to hit that creature, though, it's to hit his own.
Coming down, exiling the Harbinger. All of Theo's mana back online. A third counter spell for John. So awkward into this Aether Vial. We have a hand of counterspell, 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 force of negation.
Yeah, and you're seeing here from Theo. I've got my dog in. What can go wrong? Like you mentioned, Theo does know about the force. Yeah, I think John maybe thought there was a chance to interact with the Aether Vial there, although I'm unsure exactly what was happening. Maybe there's just some confusion. But anyways,
Okay.
things are
Theo
not
has
looking.
another Aether Vial in hand. There is no rest for John on the horizon.
Yeah, and you're seeing one of the really strong parts of Emperor Bones. I mean, people think of this card and they think of it like a Reanimator card. And when working on this card, I really thought of it more like a Jund threat that could go in Reanimator. And you're seeing why, because when you grab things like Solitude, it really turns into one in a black Solitude you again. You know, the Solitude doesn't stick around. Sometimes it does get attacked and you get a little 3 life, but Theo just has another kill spell. And it's just so hard for John to get out of the spot.
Yeah, I mean, Theo just generating so much value. Just playing that Aether Vial, John going to counter it. You gotta start casting these counter spells. As we're gonna get a Flicker Wisp, which can come in uncounterable.
Yeah.
Is that a surgical?
That's the surgical. I mean, this is the awkward part of the surgical, right? We talked about how, the Solitudes might be enough to fight over. Maybe the Overlords are enough to fight over to warrant this card. We had mentioned doing it in lieu of these counter spells, but even, if we had other interactive cards, it kind of shows how it can be a little awkward if you don't get it early, because Theo's goal is for Solitude to never be in the graveyard. Theo wants it in hand or on the board. Now, that doesn't always work out, but it can be a little awkward when you're behind, as we are going to see the vial activate.
Yeah. Emperor of Bones ended up, protecting the Solitude. Kind of interesting.
Yeah. I wonder if that was something that was on Theo's mind as well. I mean, obviously it was the best creature, but, it is a situation where you could have taken one of John's spells to make Murktide smaller. It's not an issue to, not worry about that. So I don't know. I think it's some interesting stuff here. Boom, counterspell. Taste it.
Counter spell. Get rid of that Orcish Bowmasters. As Theo just has, lethal on board.
It does look that way to me, especially once you adapt, get that Oculus in play. Oculus Aether Violet combo. Not really the way we normally think of the combo right now, but
As we're going to go ahead and swing out for lethal. John, nothing in hand that can stop this.
now this is where you're John. You surgical Theo, write down his deck list, and then go over to the NRG booth and pick it up.
And that is going to be game. Congratulations, Theo Jung 2-0 in our very first match of the NRG Modern 10K Showdown. Congratulations to Theo showing expert skill on this black-white flicker deck.
Yeah, I mean, listen, like we said at the beginning, Theo's the one who popularized this deck. Theo is, a pro tour player of one of the highest caliber, works with people like Team Channel Fireball. You're going to expect type play from him no matter what. But the deck that he also likes, you're going to see even more from that. And, when we interviewed Theo when he won champs, one of the things he said is, my Pioneer deck choice isn't the best deck in the world, but it's a deck I really love and I've put a lot of time in. And when the moments like that come, I try and play those decks. Well, Theo found that in Modern. I'd be very worried if I was a competitor against Theo, because not only does this deck look very good every time I see it, it also is something that he's loving and putting time into. I don't know. I wouldn't want to be in the Chicagoland area against Theo today or tomorrow. It's going to be a tough place to be.
Absolutely. Theo showing that he is here. He is back for 2025, ready to, fight for a spot on the leaderboard immediately. And I am excited to see where he's going to go. Now, we are going to take a short break, but don't go anywhere. We will be right back with more magic. We've got Modern coming at you all day today, so stay tuned.